The African colonial masters not only came to Africa for the slave trade and African resources, but they also brought religion to Africa, although Africa already knew God before the white man came. I believe the first Europeans that came to Africa, such as the Gold Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria, weren't missionaries but traders and explorers who came for African resources such as gold. In doing this, the Europeans found it very difficult to easily rule an African brain, and it takes a long time for a real African brain to be totally convinced. I believe, and the colonialists believe the same way, that you can easily rule an African man by providing for their needs to solve their problems. However, this may be a short-term rule because there's an African saying, "The fool might one day be wise." So, the white people chose the short term as the primary purpose to trade short term and chose the long term for an everlasting trading brand, churches. I believe the religion introduced by our colonial masters brought a lot of positive impacts to Africa, changing lives, preaching peace in Africa, and, most importantly, bringing togetherness. However, I personally argue and believe there's always another side to everything. The colonial churches such as Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, and Presbyterian were mainly established firstly to worship God and secondly to build a trade brand where they could easily communicate, trade, and still rule the African brain. That's why currently, these churches are into businesses like banks. Have you thought of church members going for loans at church banks with high interest rates? And why churches in Ghana? A missionary church is a missionary church. Send all this money back to the diaspora? Now, these churches have built a long-time brain trust in the sense that every religious person only likes to patronize religious businesses. A Christian market woman will choose to take a loan or patronize only her church's businesses and products, even if they're expensive with high rates in the market because she believes the church is for God and everything will be right and fair, but she forgets all these businesses are controlled by men, not God. The missionaries have not only built church brands that can easily convince ordinary Africans, but rather convince the whole government and big institutions in Africa. That's why the churches can easily get loans and easily access resources like good lands. Again, not talking about how these missionaries changed the way Africans worship God, and that also took a long process through the establishment of religion. They brought in some musical instruments to replace the African instruments used to worship God, such as the fontanfrom. These instruments are believed to be used to call the Spirit of God into our presence. I think African instruments shouldn't be completely abolished in our churches, but rather used or added to the modern ones, because Africans cannot totally worship God the same way the white people do. Although we are all one people, but I believe we have different cultures. On the other hand, as an African philosopher, I believe colonial churches in Africa have a main second purpose, which is to grow and modernize the brand of colonial trade in Africa. Peter the Philosopher, PTP.